met him by chance, my new neighbor. Younger, quieter, too observant. We barely spoke, never touched. But night after night, something inside me shifted. I wasn't looking for this. I didn't want this. But then he said the one thing I couldn't ignore. The town of Ravenshore had a stillness to it that either comforted you or drove you mad. For Victor Granger, it was both. The hush of the waves outside his window had become part of his routine, a background noise that kept him just grounded enough to not drown in his thoughts. The house he had moved into after the divorce stood slightly elevated on a cliff, modest but with large windows that drank in the gray sky and the slow, endless ocean. It was supposed to be a place of healing, space to breathe, but solitude has a way of making even the most stable minds unravel, thread by thread. Victor spent his mornings walking the winding coastal trail with a coffee in one hand and silence wrapped around his shoulders like a coat. It was on one of those walks, about 2 weeks after he moved in, that he first saw Jasper Lane. The man had just finished unloading a small moving van 2 doors down. Younger than Victor by maybe 10 years, Jasper had the kind of energy that didn't match the lethargy of Ravenshore. Stillness didn't seem to sit naturally on him. There was something about the way he stood, like he was waiting for something or someone to give him a reason to stay. Their first exchange was brief. A nod, a polite smile. Victor kept walking. Days passed. They ran into each other again, at the local grocery store, the coffee shop, along the trail. There was no sense of urgency between them, only a soft repetition that slowly carved out space for something unspoken. Familiarity grew, not through words, but through shared moments of quiet. Victor told himself he wasn't watching, that he didn't notice the way Jasper's eyes scanned the shelves, or how he always wore headphones but never seemed to play any music, that he didn't linger too long when their eyes met at the end of the produce aisle. On one particularly wind-swept afternoon, Victor returned from a walk to find Jasper crouched in front of his house, struggling with a leaking pipe beneath the front deck. A snapped joint, water spraying at intervals. "You need help?" Victor asked, the words foreign on his tongue. Jasper looked up, caught off guard. His reply was just a nod, nothing more. Victor fetched his tools without a word, crouching beside him. Their arms brushed once, brief, accidental, and both men stiffened slightly, like the contact had awakened something buried. They worked in silence. Afterward, Jasper murmured a quiet thank you and retreated inside. The days turned colder. The sky took on a more permanent shade of steel. Victor buried himself in work, tried to avoid the way the air seemed heavier when Jasper walked by his window. There was nothing strange about admiring a neighbor, he told himself. People notice people. That's all it was. But it wasn't. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the ocean in a blaze of copper and ash, Victor sat on his porch with a blanket draped over his lap and a whiskey glass in his hand. Jasper passed by, hands in his jacket pockets, gaze fixed forward. Victor didn't say anything, but he watched. He always watched. Jasper paused, just for a moment, long enough to look toward the porch. Their eyes met. He gave a small wave, more instinct than invitation, and kept walking. Victor's glass paused midair. The silence between them was growing louder. He began to notice small details, too many, too closely. How Jasper always walked the same route, at the same time. How he seemed to linger at the edge of conversations with strangers, like he was searching for something he couldn't quite name. How his smile didn't reach his eyes. Victor knew that kind of emptiness. He warned himself. Some nights, he would find himself standing at the kitchen window, light off, watching the faint glow from Jasper's living room spill across the street. Sometimes Jasper sat alone on the couch, staring at a blank TV. Sometimes he paced. Sometimes he just sat still, like he was waiting for something to break. Victor told himself it wasn't his business, that whatever loneliness haunted the young man across the street, it wasn't his to soothe. But something inside him kept leaning forward, kept listening. The distance between them was only a few steps, yet it felt like an entire coastline. Victor couldn't explain why it mattered. Maybe it was the way Jasper existed quietly, respectfully, as if he understood that healing people need space, but also that they rarely know how to ask for help. Maybe it was the way Jasper never tried to force a conversation, and yet always seemed open to one. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something Victor didn't want to admit to himself. He wasn't sure what was changing, only that it was. As another week folded into the next, Victor found himself standing on the porch more often than not. Sometimes Jasper would walk by and wave. Other times he wouldn't. But the tension was growing. Not the bad kind. Not the kind that erupts. The kind that builds like fog. Quiet, slow, impossible to ignore. And in that silence, something unnamed began to take root. The rhythm of life in Ravenshore had a strange elasticity. Time seemed to stretch and compress at will, depending on the weight of your thoughts. For Victor Granger, it was beginning to stretch unbearably. He hadn't meant to fall into any kind of pattern with Jasper Lang, but somehow they had one now. Not by arrangement, not through plans, just through repetition. Like how Jasper would appear on the trail around dusk, earbuds in, but not playing anything, and how Victor would always find himself walking just a bit slower when he spotted him ahead. They rarely walked together, but they often moved through the same space. Parallel, separate, aware. On more than one occasion, they found themselves in the local diner, sitting at opposite ends of the bar. Sometimes they'd offer a nod. Once, Jasper sent the waitress back with a fresh cup of black coffee, which Victor didn't acknowledge until he was halfway through it. Another time, Victor held the door open a little too long, and their hands nearly brushed. Neither spoke. In a place like Ravenshore, silence became its own language. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was thick with meaning, but never hostile. It was more like shared solitude, like two people who had been through different kinds of storms and were now learning how to sit in the calm without asking too many questions. Victor, who had never been good at small talk or connection, found himself wondering about the details of Jasper's life. Not in the way neighbors do, but in the way you wonder about someone who feels familiar, even though you hardly know them. He didn't know why Jasper had moved here. He didn't know if Jasper was running from something or to something, but he wanted to. It scared him how much he wanted to. One evening, the rain came early and with a vengeance. It pounded the roof of Victor's porch in a steady rhythm as he stood just inside the screen door, watching the water trail down the glass. Across the street, Jasper was struggling with a bag of groceries, one arm shielding his head from the downpour. Before he could think better of it, Victor stepped out and crossed the street, an umbrella in hand. Jasper looked surprised, but didn't protest as Victor held the umbrella above them both. They walked in silence to his door. The bag was lighter than it looked, and Victor placed it carefully on the kitchen counter. Jasper offered a wordless nod and a half-smile that didn't quite settle. Victor didn't stay, but that moment lingered. The next week, they exchanged more than nods. It started small, Jasper offering a cup of tea when Victor passed by his porch. Victor hesitated before accepting. They sat outside, not speaking for long minutes. When Jasper finally broke the silence, he didn't ask a question or make a joke. He simply said, "Some nights are worse than others." Victor didn't answer. He didn't have to. Jasper knew he understood. After that, the conversations came in slow waves. Nothing heavy, nothing that felt like confession. Just stories, fragments of old memories, observations about the sea or the sound the wind made when it slipped through the pine trees behind the houses. They never discussed anything too close to the heart. And yet, everything they shared felt deeply personal. Victor found himself waiting for these moments, not in a way that made him restless, but in the quiet ache of anticipation. He'd grown used to Jasper's presence, and worse, had grown to need it. One night, Victor invited Jasper over for dinner. It was casual, unplanned. He made too much soup, and the invitation came out more like an apology than an offer. Jasper arrived with a bottle of wine and a quiet smile. They ate slowly, the sound of the rain tapping the windows like a metronome. Afterward, they sat in the living room, each holding a half-empty glass. Victor noticed the way Jasper tucked one leg under the other when he sat, the way his fingers lingered around the stem of the glass, the way his eyes drifted across the room, never settling too long in one place. Jasper laughed once, soft, low, unguarded, at something Victor had said without intending it to be funny. The sound hit Victor in a strange place, a place he hadn't touched in years. When Jasper left that night, something had shifted, not in any obvious way. There had been no confession, no touch, not even prolonged eye contact. But Victor felt it. The weight in the air had changed. There was something unspoken beginning to take shape. Something fragile. Something dangerous. Later, lying in bed, Victor stared at the ceiling and tried to name it. But there was no word for what was forming between them. It wasn't friendship, though it wore that mask. It wasn't desire, not openly. It was something more tender, more patient, like a wound that didn't hurt, only reminded you it was there. He turned on his side and closed his eyes. Across the street, a light turned off. The season had turned quietly in Ravenshore. One day the air was merely cool. The next it had teeth. Leaves began to fall in slow spirals across driveways and porches, a silent reminder that time was passing whether you were ready for it or not. Victor Granger had always liked autumn. He appreciated its honesty, the way it didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. He admired how it revealed the bones of things. Bare branches, thinning light, silence between gusts of wind. There was clarity in decay, in endings. But nothing about what was unfolding between him and Jasper Lane felt clear. They were still falling into each other's lives in subtle ways. A book left behind. A dinner extended into a movie. Long stretches of silence that were less about awkwardness and more about safety. But under the surface, something was fraying. Victor could feel it in Jasper's gaze, how it lingered too long and carried too much. How his posture shifted when they were alone, like he was trying to hold something inside that didn't want to be hidden anymore. One evening, they sat outside on Victor's back deck. The sky was streaked with deep orange and ash, the last of the sunlight clinging to the edge of the sea. Neither had spoken for a while. They didn't need to, but Jasper looked restless, his leg bouncing, his hands fidgeting with the fabric of his sleeves. Victor noticed. He always noticed. When Jasper finally broke the silence, it wasn't with small talk or observation. His voice was low, almost unsteady, like each word had been debated in his throat before being released. Do you ever feel like you're trying so hard to be normal that you forget who you are? Victor didn't answer at first. Not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. He'd spent years molding himself into something safe, something predictable. He knew how much it cost to bury what didn't fit. I think we all do that sometimes, he said eventually, keeping his voice level. Jasper nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the horizon. His expression held something quiet and urgent. I spent years telling myself it was a phase. That would go away. Victor's heart tightened. He didn't need the rest of the sentence to understand. It was the kind of sentence that hung between men who had walked through similar storms. Half-spoken truths loaded with memory and pain. Jasper turned to look at him then. His gaze was direct, and there was no hiding in it. But it didn't, he said. And now I'm here. And you're here. And I don't know what any of this is. Victor felt something shift inside him, something like fear or maybe recognition. The deck was silent, but not still. The air seemed to crackle with things they had both been too careful to say. I don't want to mess up whatever this is, Jasper added, his voice softer now. But I'm tired of pretending I don't feel anything. Victor looked at him, really looked at him. Jasper wasn't just younger. He was raw, open in ways Victor had taught himself not to be. And yet, something in that openness felt like home. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words that would be both truthful and safe. So instead, he reached forward slowly, not to touch but to close the space between them just enough to say, without speaking, I hear you. The sun dipped beneath the waterline, and shadows swallowed the deck. Jasper stood first. His movements were quiet, restrained, but something in them felt lighter, as if just saying the truth out loud had unburdened a part of him. He paused at the top of the stairs, glanced back, and offered a small, almost hesitant smile. Victor returned it, small but not empty. Later that night, Victor lay awake in bed, the conversation echoing in his mind like waves hitting the shore. The truth was, He didn't know what to do with any of it. He had built a life out of structure and logic, out of boundaries clearly drawn and rarely crossed. And yet here was Jasper, standing just beyond the lines, not demanding anything, just waiting. It wasn't about age. It wasn't even about fear. It was about undoing, about what happened when something or someone force you to confront the parts of yourself you'd silenced. Victor closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. Whatever came next, it would no longer be quiet. The days had grown shorter in Ravenshore. By late afternoon, the light had already begun to fade, casting the narrow streets in long, uncertain shadows. Victor Granger noticed these changes more acutely now. The shifting of seasons felt symbolic, like time was trying to remind him that something was approaching, something he could no longer avoid. Jasper Lane hadn't visited in 3 days. Not that they had agreed to any sort of routine, but the absence was palpable. The silence had gone from soft to sharp, and Victor found himself pacing through his house more than usual, pausing at windows, standing too long by the phone without any real reason. He wasn't good at waiting, and yet he waited. On the 4th day, just as the sky was dipping into a deep slate gray, there was a knock at the back door. Quiet, hesitant. Victor opened it to find Jasper standing there, his expression unreadable, his hands buried in the pockets of a worn jacket. They didn't speak at first. Jasper stepped inside, brushing past Victor without ceremony. The air between them crackled with everything they had said, and more pressingly, everything they hadn't. Victor offered tea, but Jasper shook his head. Instead, they sat at opposite ends of the living room, the space between them wide but charged. For a long while, neither said anything. The television hummed quietly in the background, playing something neither of them were watching. Victor's gaze kept drifting toward Jasper's face, how tightly his jaw was set, how his fingers tapped silently against the armrest. Eventually, Victor leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice barely above a whisper. "You disappeared." Jasper didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, it wasn't with an apology. "I needed space. I didn't want to push something that shouldn't be pushed." Victor flinched at the phrasing, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. The silence returned, thicker now, more tense. Victor's breath felt shallow. He didn't know how to say what was building in his chest. He didn't know if he should, but the moment was swelling, demanding to be acknowledged. Jasper shifted in his seat, his foot brushing against the leg of the coffee table. The contact was minor, incidental, but it sent something electric through Victor's veins. "I haven't stopped thinking about that night," Jasper said suddenly, his voice tight. "Not because of what I said, but because of what you didn't." Victor closed his eyes. He could still hear those words in the dark, echoing between them. "I don't know what any of this is." And the answer he'd never given. "I didn't know how to respond," Victor admitted. "Still don't." Jasper nodded slowly. He stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the darkening street. His reflection in the glass looked like a ghost, half-formed, waiting to disappear. "I never asked you to respond. I needed you to see me." Victor rose without thinking, his steps quiet across the wooden floor. He stopped beside Jasper, but didn't touch him. "Not yet. I do see you," he said. "That's the problem." Jasper turned his head, their eyes locking. And in that look, silent, desperate, raw, something broke. Or maybe it was something being born. Victor reached out, not boldly, but with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from finally accepting what can no longer be denied. His hand found Jasper's, and their fingers tangled instinctively. The touch was nothing dramatic. No fireworks, just warmth, real and alive and dangerous in its simplicity. They stood there, still and close, the noise of the outside world blurring into irrelevance. Victor could feel Jasper's breath, uneven but steadying. He felt his own chest rising faster now, not from fear but from recognition. And then, too soon or perhaps exactly when it needed to happen, Jasper leaned forward. Not abruptly, not with expectation, just a quiet gesture, a closing of distance. Their foreheads touched before anything else. A pause, a shared breath, and then a kiss. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't hungry. It was careful, like they were both afraid it would end as soon as it began. And when they pulled apart, it wasn't awkward, but it was fragile. Jasper stepped back, his eyes shining with something Victor couldn't name. "I should go," he said softly. Victor didn't argue. He watched Jasper slip through the door into the cool evening. The latch clicked behind him like a final note in a song that had taken years to play. Victor stood there, alone again. But everything was different now. The line between them had been crossed. Not in haste, not in confusion, but in clarity. And once crossed, there would be no going back. The morning after felt too quiet, even for Ravensshore. Victor Granger woke before the sun had fully broken over the horizon. Light crept slowly into the room, sliding across the hardwood floor like something uncertain of its welcome. The air was cool, the sheets beside him untouched. He hadn't slept well, not out of regret, but because something inside him refused to settle. The previous night replayed in fragments. The touch of Jasper's hand, the closeness, the kiss that hovered on the edge of restraint and revelation, and then the silence that followed, not between them, but within Victor himself. He sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, listening to the distant cries of seabirds and the occasional soft clink of branches brushing against the windows. The house felt the same as always. But he wasn't. Jasper hadn't called, hadn't texted. Victor didn't expect him to. What they had stepped into wasn't something that could be unraveled over the phone. It lived in gestures, in pauses, in the way the world around them shifted every time they were near each other. And now it lived in absence. Later that afternoon, Victor wandered to the bluff where the ocean spread endlessly before him, churning and indifferent. He often came here when he needed clarity. But today, the water didn't soothe. It reminded. The sea didn't care what you buried in it. Eventually, it brought everything back. Behind him, the sound of footsteps on gravel broke through the wind. Slow. Familiar. Victor didn't turn immediately. He waited until Jasper stood beside him, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, gaze fixed on the same endless horizon. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The quiet between them wasn't strained. It was something more sacred. A truce, perhaps, or an understanding that words might only diminish what had already been spoken in silence. Victor stole a glance. Jasper's profile was calm, but not detached. There was weight in his stillness, like he had come here with purpose. And yet, he didn't force anything. That had never been Jasper's way. Eventually, Victor broke the silence. "I didn't expect to see you today." Jasper's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "I didn't expect to come." They stood there like that, side by side, the wind threading through their coats. Victor felt the weight of all the questions he still couldn't answer pressing against his ribs. And yet, none of them felt urgent anymore. After a while, Jasper spoke again, his voice low. "I don't want to rush you. I just didn't want that night to be the end of something." Victor looked down at the ground, at the crushed leaves under their feet. "I don't know what it was," he admitted, "but I know it wasn't nothing." Jasper nodded. "That's enough." No promises were made. No plans were set. But something softened between them, something unspoken agreeing to stay open, at least for now. They walked back slowly, gravel crunching beneath their steps. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long golden lines across the quiet streets of Ravensshore. When they reached Victor's house, they paused at the gate. Jasper turned to him, his eyes meeting Victor's without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. Victor nodded once, the knot in his chest easing just enough to let air in. "Neither am I." That evening, they sat on the porch with mugs of tea, the sky above them bruised purple and amber. The air between them no longer held tension. It held space. Room to breathe, to be, to grow. They didn't touch, didn't speak much. But it wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore. It was the quiet that follows a storm. The kind that remains after the wind has stopped screaming, when everything is still damp and fragile, but intact. Victor watched Jasper out of the corner of his eye. The younger man leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed, content in the moment. There was something grounding about his presence, something Victor hadn't known he needed until it was there. The world had not changed. The ocean still moved. The wind still came and went. But within that stillness, Victor felt something shift inside him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but deeply. He didn't know what would come next. The future was still a blur of half-formed thoughts and unresolved fears. But for now, for this hour, this porch, this quiet companionship, he let himself rest. And beside him, Jasper did too.